Hey internets, so this video is going to explain the reasoning behind what is often seen as the most controversial libertarian position, which is unfortunate because when you understand it, it's not uncommon to realize that it's actually not that controversial at all, and actually makes perfect sense. What I'm talking about here is, of course, the abolition of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as laws that have similar negative effects in other countries, or to be more specific, repealing the parts of these laws which ban private individuals from discriminating against or disassociating themselves, as it would be better said, from anyone they want for any reason they want. In other words, the right to refuse service to anyone, period, end of discussion. Out of all libertarian musings, this one seems to take the crown for being the most confusing to the normies and the most triggering to the woketoids, with the initial reaction of those who are not very well read usually being to say that the right-leaning libertarians are all secretly Nazis because of this. That if the Civil Rights Act were to be repealed, then the country would immediately resemble World War II Germany. Interestingly enough, we can see if this is true or not, because there are countries where no such law exists. I'll even show you an example, so prepare yourselves to see this supposedly evil, fascist dictatorship in which every single section of its commerce exists to systemically oppress and exclude all the minorities trademark. And oh wait, it's literally just Japan. A first world constitutional monarchy with elements of democracy similar to the United States. Yeah, a lot of people don't know that, but Japan has no laws prohibiting racial, ethnic, or religious discrimination or whatnot, amongst private individuals anyway. So why is it then that they seem to be getting along just fine? Because you may occasionally find a business here which refuses to serve a foreigner unless they are with a Japanese person, or sometimes refuse service entirely. Well, it's quite simple really, because most of the time it doesn't make economic sense to do so. When a business refuses to deal with foreigners, they are then losing out on the money they could have gained from them, and can potentially lose out in competition to those who don't refuse said business. For example, say a ramen stand decides to only serve ice fairies, but then another ramen stand opens up serving everyone. Not only will the second ramen stand earn more money from more customers, but they could even raise their prices if they wanted to, and thus earn even more profit from it. Or if, say, a bank only allowed ice fairies, they will not have as much cash flow as a competitor bank that allows anyone to open an account. This financial incentive repeats for just about everything. And it's why the right to refuse service doesn't automatically result in service always being refused, because it just doesn't make financial sense to do so. Which at this point, some of the libs might ask, well, then why not just make it illegal anyways? I mean, what's the harm? It's bad when it happens, so just make it against the law. Well, no. The reason this is a bad idea is because civil rights are in fact not the noble Muh equality deal that Western liberals have been sold, quite possibly taking the #1 trophy slot for the biggest piece of well-meaning legislation with the largest amount of unintended consequences attached to it. There is a stark contrast between what civil rights are supposed to do, claim to do, which is supposedly create a society of justice and freedom and equality for all, etc., and what civil rights laws actually do, which is that they take away people's freedom of association, aka the people's right to interact and form communities with whoever they choose, which is of course a two-way street. Both the individual and the people in the community they wish to join must consent to this. And if you don't have that two-way handshake, it's not freedom of association. Interestingly enough, this is the same problem with a lot of Jim Crow laws and why many libertarians reject those laws as well, such as banning miscegnation or white and blacks shaking hands being illegal. These also take away people's freedom of association. So all the libertarian right position on civil rights is really doing is correctly identifying Jim Crow and civil rights as two sides of the same flawed coin, rather than civil rights somehow being a solution to Jim Crow, which they are not. So one side forces segregation and the other side of the coin forces integration, but both sides violate the property rights of those involved as they dictate what they can and cannot do with their property. But wait, the lib may once again contest, isn't forcing people to get along at least better than forcing people to not get along? Well, sort of. In the short term anyways, but in the long run, not really. Because taking freedom of association away, regardless of context, has some very serious negative side effects to the point where forced integration can actually lead to desire for more segregation. So let's take a look at what some of those problems are. The first of these issues comes down to the question of how civil rights laws are actually enforced. How exactly do you know if someone is discriminating against someone anyways? If you are a minority and someone treats you poorly, how do you know they are doing it because you are a minority trademark or not? As the victim perception fallacy shows, people are extremely bad at being able to tell if they are actually facing prejudice or not. And because of this, we have enshrined into law the utter insanity that is the disparate impact standard. This brings to the legal table the idea that unequal outcomes are being caused by discrimination, regardless of whether or not intent to discriminate can be proven. Or in other words, civil rights laws necessitate the use of the equity fallacy, where any inequality of outcome can be used in court as evidence of violating civil rights. And this is where things get kind of silly, because if you explain this to a centrist what disparate impact is and what it does, many of them will strongly disagree with disparate impact and concede that the disparate impact standard should be abolished, not knowing that this is in practice the same thing as how civil rights laws are addressed. Disparate impact is also the main legal power provider to the cult of woke. The main praxis of wokeness is to paint themselves as victims to justify aggression towards whoever they have decided the bad guy boogeyman oppressor is. And having an element of inequality of outcome existing in our legal system provides them the perfect tool to make absurd, sweeping claims of victimhood in an increasingly hostile march towards socialism, which they can then legally force private businesses to take their insanity seriously by simply making sweeping, unfalsifiable accusations as disparate impact shifts the burden of proof onto the accused to somehow show proof of the negative that they are not discriminating. Again, if you are a liberal centrist, you may have noticed how all of this is very stupid and how the woke behave is very insane. Well, guess what? Civil rights is the prime enabler of this behavior. It's exactly what they need to force people to fall in line with their equity march, as the disparate impact standard actually requires society to not be colorblind. This is also why the academic definition of racism, that racism equals prejudice plus power, along with unequal outcomes, runs contradictory toward the colloquial definition of racism, as the layman's definition implies that colorblindness is good, while the academic definition implies that colorblindness is bad. And guess what? Disparate impact uses the academic definition, as does civil rights, by necessity. This is also the issue with Martin Luther King's line on people not being judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, which is a perfectly fine statement that libertarians in fact agree with. The problem is that statement actually contradicts how civil rights laws work in practice, which means that if you agree with MLK's "I have a dream" speech, you actually disagree with modern academics and disparate impact. This actually requires private businesses to discriminate against any supposed collective group that is doing well, in order to make sure that they are compliant with these standards. And thus you get counterproductive ideas like affirmative action. Or even worse, you actually get reduction of academic standards, such as Oregon reducing what is needed to graduate high school, no longer requiring students to be able to do basic reading and math, purely because those qualifications are more likely to have a disparate standard effect on minorities. Despite the fact that all this really does is reduce the prestige of having a degree, thus screwing everybody else over, reducing the value of any diploma achieved within the state of Oregon, and really any academic institution that practices similar clownery. The second problem is that discrimination is in fact sometimes justified. For example, the phrase "Islam is right about women," which as some people have figured out, yes, I was the person who came up with this, no, I'm not sorry, and yes, I would do it again, in fact, I already have. But beyond that, Islam is right about women, what it really shows is an interesting, unique situation where people from different cultures would actually be justified in not wanting to associate with each other. For instance, Muslims generally don't want to have to deal with screeching modern feminists whose beliefs run counter to their own. Similarly, most feminism practice runs counter to the traditional gender roles and pro-patriarchy that is present within this Islamic doctrine. So when civil rights comes along, this creates an ideological contradiction crisis. If you force them to get along with each other at gunpoint, then one of them has to stop being what they are. One party would have to completely revise their beliefs, which implies that there must be some inequality between them. This is why so many lefty progs have trouble answering the question, is Islam right about women? Because it forces them to acknowledge the inherent contradiction with trying to pretend that everyone is equally correct. How can everyone be right if people from different cultural backgrounds often hold contradictory beliefs and customs? Obviously they cannot. But civil rights laws comes along like a bumbling drunken idiot to take away people's freedom of association, so Clown World is now forced to jackhammer these two things together regardless of whether or not it can work. And the progs in response are forced to, well, basically just deny reality outright. The third problem is that forced integration gets in the way of true integration. Over 100 years ago, around the Industrial Revolutions, Irish immigrants faced a large degree of ethnic discrimination to the point of being banned from many private businesses with "No Irish" signs. And yet, that discrimination mysteriously vanished without the need for the Civil Rights Act. Why did it vanish? Well, it's simple really, because colorblindness works. Irish immigrants had an incentive to actually find ways to get along with and become Americans, as opposed to just using civil rights to try and force everyone else to just accept them by identifying as a protected class trademark. But that very act of identity politics alone contradicts colorblindness, which means people have an incentive under civil rights to never truly integrate, not just because they don't have to, but because it would give up their protected status. Why make any concessions when you can just sit back and claim infinite victimhood? Going back to Japan as an example, the most common form of discrimination you're going to run into with Japan is for private businesses to ban people who don't speak Japanese. But imagine what would happen if this were attacked with civil rights laws of today and ruled illegal due to having a disparate impact on the minorities. Well, the answer is they would have less need to actually integrate into the culture and learn the Japanese language. It would effectively reward laziness at the expense of the natives. And this really shows the problem with disparate impact in taking away freedom of association. It necessarily enslaves those who do not have protected status enshrined in the civil rights laws to those that do have the protected status. This problem has been called out extensively in the concept of the second or new constitution in the book The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell, which I strongly recommend to anyone looking to understand this in greater detail. But anyways, the issue that all of these problems have in common is that civil rights by necessity requires state aggression to work. It requires an authoritative power structure to sit as a monopoly above everyone else, dictating what private individuals can and cannot do with their property. This means that civil rights is intrinsically tied to the problems inherent to centralized power dynamics, and would in fact be better called civil entitlements rather than civil rights, as all civil rights laws really do in practice is make people feel entitled to respect rather than to having to actually organically earn that respect. But that's not true respect, is it? That's just permanent victimhood. It's not going to solve any problems, it hasn't solved any problems, and if anything has just made racial relations worse, as taking away freedom of association like this actually prevents meritocracy and prevents individualism from ever really being a thing. Rather, instead, the incentive with civil rights laws is to lock people into an eternal collectivist struggle for who can be the biggest victim in order to gain access to the second constitution. In conclusion, civil rights laws are in fact not the great defender of equality. Rather, it is exactly the opposite, as the equality between collectives it seeks necessarily contradicts equality between individuals. Anyways, that's all for now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, share, subscribe, or tip me on Ko-Fi, or leave a comment for the algorithm and all that stuff. Till next time.